Hello, hello. And welcome everyone to another Marketing Society evening. True story. Sitting with one of our customers one day, who's actually a merchant, who's very successful, selling lots of products around the world, billions of them actually. And we sat down about the future of the company. One of the first tricks to say is that his family name was on the product. So very sensitive to talk about that and change anything when you talk about brands. I said, who do you sell to? And that's when it kind of struck me. Everybody. That's the word that he said. I sell to everybody. And of course we had a couple of branding experts around the table and said that's the first challenge, is that you cannot sell to everybody or be a brand to everybody. So when you reflect on some of these conversations and where some of our customers around the industry come from, you reflect on some of the challenges that we talk about in the marketing society. It's the brand and what does it mean and who does it mean to, and then of course the big question is, what's the value of my brand to my business? So we will talk about that. Let me introduce myself. My name is Khalid Ismail. I'm the chair of the Marketing Society, and I also have a day job, like most of you. I'm the VP Communications for Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa for a small company called Tetra Pak. We are going to be having a very interesting conversation around brand today in association with our friends at Landor. And this didn't come by accident because we have a very demanding board member. Where is he? Where's Ash? He brings in a lot of insights to the table, and we like to because we have wonderful boards. You'll meet them, some of them are here. And the conversation was, what we see in this part of the world, not that we're behind or forward, there are some certain challenges with the growth that we see, is that we shoot first and then aim later, especially when it comes to brand. And I think this is fitting with what we're going to be talking about here today with our speakers from Landor and the panel, fantastic panel by the way. I think they've got lots to say. So I will leave you with them in a second. But join the conversation, please. We want the people who are not with us because they're either stuck in traffic or lazy at home to learn about what we're talking about here. So please join the conversation. And let me introduce you to Nick Cooper from Landor, who's the global lead on insights and analytics.
I just need to make sure this is switched on.
Yours.
Yes.
That is on now.
Yes.
You can hear me all right?
Yes.
No, that's better. Great. Look, it's thank you very much, Khalid. It's great to be in Dubai again and to have the opportunity to talk to so many of you who've managed to struggle through the traffic and give up your evenings. I hope that individually and collectively it'll all be worthwhile. But it's great to have this opportunity to talk about a little bit about insights and analytics from the point of view specifically about brand. As Khalid said, there is perhaps a temptation to shoot first and aim later. So one of the things that we find commonly is that clients want greater certainty around their strategic brand decisions. So if you're going to do something major with your brand or you're going to change your brand, that's actually a very big commitment. And that involves potentially some very substantial sums of money. So what the aim of this is to try and provide not necessarily the right answer, because no one's got a crystal ball, but to try and provide something that actually gives greater certainty around that decision and to actually enhance what is often used in terms of experience and gut feel, to actually put some data and some insight behind that so that you're more certain than you would have been that the decision is right. The reason why we do this is because there is in the end only one reason to have a brand, and that's to make money. Brands are expensive to set up, they're even more expensive to maintain, and if you can't make money back on that, then quite frankly, you just might as well run a commodity business. That's not a value judgment, but it's just a statement of fact that you might as well just have a commodity because you'll make more money out of it. And one of the conversations that we see, and not only us, but we see all the time, is that if you want to take brand to board level, you have to express it in the only common currency that there is, which is money. And the fact of the matter is that brands do drive businesses and brands do create substantial value add to many, many companies. And if you imagine if you're Gucci handbags, for the sake of argument, how much of that is down to brand? But even if you're GE Aero engines, then brand still has a lot to do with it. And if you're not managing your brand, you're not managing the full value of the business, and that's language that boards understand, and that's the sort of language that marketing increasingly has to speak. So what we find very often is that whilst clients are still always looking for greater exploration and greater insights, actually what is growing faster is that top line, the need for greater objectivity, the need for greater benchmarking, and above all the need for greater validation. And in many ways, when marketing is competing for investment against other parts of the business, that's the language that other parts of the business already speak about objectivity, benchmarking, validation. So it is incumbent upon marketing to get better at that language, however that's done. And one of the things that we find useful is having an interlocking skill set. So everyone's familiar with research insights. That's great. And that's really, really important. If you don't know what your consumers or your customers are thinking, then you really are just guessing. However, increasingly, the research insights are there actually to fund what's going to happen tomorrow, because actually what's more interesting is what's happening down the track rather than what's happening today. And therefore, increasingly, we're doing a lot of modeling around the market, which is a kind of outside-in view. So how is the market going to develop over the next 5 years? And how is your brand going to perform, given that that's the market we think is going to develop? And then financial modeling is also important. How do we put numbers, how do we put commercial numbers around the performance of the brand and the projected performance of the brand? Because again, when it comes to competing for investment, that's what the rest of the business does already. So we've come up with a bunch of tools. We're not going to bore you to death with taking you through all of those, but essentially I'm going to cherry pick a few. But there are things that we try and do, which is to analyze the situation starting at the bottom left, to understand how to execute brand better and how to measure that execution as it goes through, and then to identify growth opportunities, and in particular to accelerate those growth opportunities, which is what marketing should be about, I think. And it's how we can use better measurement in service of better marketing. So just a few tools that we want to talk about. The first one is Brand Asset Valuator and Brand Differential. Brand Asset Valuator is Landor's proprietary methodology for measuring brand equity. I think it's very important that as marketers, the key currency we deal with is brand equity. That's what we have to develop. That's why we are in marketing, because we all love brand. So we need a way of measuring it. BAV is one way of measuring it, which comes from a database that's been around for 25 years, but more importantly, has a validated methodology for understanding how brand equity is created through these 4 pillars of differentiation, relevance, esteem, and knowledge, and also an ability to benchmark how those grow over time. We also have this measure at the end, the brand asset score, which enables us to monetize brand and start to measure brand in financial sense as well, which is very important in many conversations. So as a starting point, you have to have a way of measuring brand. BAV is Landor's way of measuring it. But that then, as a starting point, leads on to many other questions and very important questions that keep coming up from clients. And one tool we have called Brand Differential answers some very interesting questions from clients, which start with, how can I measure a concept? How can I measure something that doesn't exist? How can I measure a positioning that isn't yet in the marketplace? And more particularly, can I compare it and measure it against what I've got already? Because again, as marketers, we like making the case for change. And if you're going to make the case for change, how do you do that? And it's particularly good if you can get to a point where you can say, actually, I can tell which one's going to perform better for you. So I can tell whether you ought to keep your current brand or whether you ought to change it. And again, the way we measure that, we have benchmarked measurements in order to understand how a concept performs. We can then turn that into a projected brand equity, so which means we can compare it against something that already exists. And then we also have a methodology for projecting how that brand equity might perform over time and grow, and therefore we can project where you are today with where you might be tomorrow. And that answers the question. I mean, just to take a case in point, a CEO recently said, "I know how much it costs to change a brand. What I don't know is if I'll get my money back." And that's the key question for a CEO who's not a marketing person, but that's the key question. And marketing has to come up with an answer to that question. Because real or imagined, if you talk to the sales guys or the operations guys or the logistics guys or the manufacturing guys, they all have or claim to have answers to those sorts of questions. So we must too. And that's a fascinating way of doing it. We also hear a lot around a question about brand portfolio optimization, where the key question here is, how many brands do I need? Not how many brands have I got, but how many brands do I need? And there are some instances where clients actually don't even know how many brands they've got, to be fair. It's quite rare, but it does happen. But how many brands do I need? Which brands should they be, and how should I deploy them? And this is, again, when we talk about brand change, it's really, really key. When you talk about moving brands in and out of portfolios, the conversation very quickly becomes subjective, qualitative, and unquantified. It becomes very backward facing. I used to work on that brand. I invented that brand. You can't get rid of it. I know the guy who runs that brand. He's great, so that brand must be great, so you can't get rid of it. What you need in those situations is something that's far more objective, far more quantified, and far more future-facing. And the way we answer that is the first thing we do is that we go out and do some research with consumers to see what they think. Because very often when it comes to brand portfolio optimization, the view of brand from inside the company is actually not backed up by any data. So the first thing is to say, well, what do our consumers or our customers or our clients think? The second thing is, okay, well, let's understand how we model this out, to understand if we start changing things, will we be better off or worse off? And then let's actually understand the scenarios that we want to look at to understand which brands we should potentially keep, which ones we should replace, and maybe even if we need new ones. And just a couple of examples to illustrate the impact of this. I mean, when we look at somebody like Henkel Industrial Adhesives, which is a world-leading company in terms of things like sticking wings to aeroplanes, which is a bit scary. They had a bit of a smorgasbord of brands, which was created through many years of acquisition. We did some work that actually said these are the brands that you need, and more particularly, this was the incremental commercial impact. Because they were a successful business anyway, but they became more successful. And we've recently done a similar thing for Adecco, which is the world's largest recruitment company. Again, they'd grown through acquisition. It was all a bit of a mush. We said this is what you need, including a couple of new brands, and this is the commercial impact that has taken place for them. The profit has not grown quite so much because they had to launch some new brands, and as I said at the beginning, brands are expensive, so they need to pay their way. The last thing I want to talk about, and Carly said at the beginning, sort of you can't necessarily market to everyone. Marketing to everyone is actually really, really difficult. So one of the things that comes in handy and actually pinpoints marketing very more finely is segmentation. Our view of segmentation is called demandscape. But this answers common client questions: is how is my market segmented? Which segments are most valuable today? And I think the billion-dollar question is, which segments are most valuable to me tomorrow? That's even more important than what's the situation today. So whilst, of course, there are lots of methodologies out there for looking at current segmentation, and there are multi-dimensional models which are great, and you can pick up all sorts of ways of looking at segmentation today through demographics, perceptions, needs, attitudes and benefits, behaviors and spending and so on. That's all very important, all that rigor. And also it's very important to deep dive into understanding what is driving consumers to make those purchase decisions today. And of course, you can come up with lots of amazing charts that blind you in terms of the amount of data is there, but as they all say, devil is in the detail. If you have that data, you can make some decent decisions about it. And also sometimes to help, you can bring it to life, and particularly for non-marketing people, the way of actually creating personas or demonstrating how consumers are different and actually bring them to life so that other functions can understand them and help make decisions about them. But I think even more important is what's happening tomorrow. So rather than just having a snapshot, how do you actually drive that picture forward and create an understanding of what the market might look like tomorrow? And one of the things that's key is that markets change all the time, segments change all the time, people change all the time, consumers change all the time, competition change all the time. So it's really important to actually understand how those personas you've identified are actually going to morph and evolve, because what is important today may not be important tomorrow. The way that opportunity clusters are spotted in the market, the way that white space is created, what you've got today is not necessarily what you're going to see tomorrow. And as we all know, there are some markets and some categories that are being disrupted at such a pace. Even a 5-year change seems like an eon of time, let alone 2 years. And one of the most interesting thing is that it starts to change your view of what your priorities are. So what is important today is not necessarily important tomorrow, and what seems unimportant today may actually become incredibly important tomorrow. And it's very important to understand how we do this and how marketing does it, because again, many other functions within the business are making multi-year decisions. If you're going to build a factory, it's not something you do in 6 weeks, it takes 3 years. So how do you build a business case? So all these skills and all these points of view are being driven through the business anyway, and they need to be, in our estimation, they need to be done very similarly in marketing, because that's how the board thinks and that's how the CEO thinks. So all of those things, I think, in terms of just summarizing what's important, I think, to brand is that we've looked at key questions like, how do I measure brand equity for existing brands and new brands or new ideas? Again, the fundament of marketing is new ideas. So how do you measure something new? How do you compare it against what you've got? And how do you know whether you're going to be better off or worse off? The second question we try to answer and talk about is brand portfolio optimization. How many brands do I need? And to be honest, this is the most common question we hear, because even if you've got one brand, that may not be the right answer. It's obvious if you've got 150 brands, you've probably got too many. But even if you've got one brand, that may not be enough. So you need to understand how many brands you need. And last but not least, in terms of segmentation, and that's a very important discipline for marketing, which segments are most important for my brand today and which are most important for my brand tomorrow? And all of these things require a blend of insights and analytics. They require a blend of soft skills, and they require a blend of hard data. And if you can put those two together, then actually the answers that marketing creates tend to be much better suited, much more future-facing, much more robust, and much more likely to be recognized and accepted by the rest of the business. So, that is the end of my little talk. Thank you very much. And in order to dive a little bit further into this, we have, as Kali said, we have a fantastic panel, and it's my privilege to introduce them. So on the panel today, we have Dan Taylor, who's the Vice President of Brand Marketing for Ras Al Khaimah Tourism and Development Authority. He's working with what he tells me is the oldest emirate. I had a little history lesson from Dan tonight, which was fascinating. So I did history at university. I was quite ashamed that I didn't actually know anything really about Ras Al Khaimah, so apologies. But he's working hard to create a live-work destination in that emirate, which sounds extremely exciting. Secondly, we're very lucky to have Ross McAuley here from Al Tayyar. Ross has been in Dubai for 12 years. He was previously CMO at Jumeirah Hotel Group and also GEMS Education, and is now running the marketing for the largest travel and tourism business in the region. Thirdly, we're also lucky to have Emma Beckman, an esteemed colleague, who's the president of Senior at Landor. Emma is a bit of a Landor lifer. What she doesn't know about Landor isn't worth knowing. She has pioneered offices in many places, not least Moscow and other very interesting frontier markets like that. And now she's in charge of our Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East and Africa business, and indeed London as well. So it's fantastic to have her here. And last but not least, we have Rami Zahran, who is CMO for Saudi German hospitals. He's in charge in particular of the hospitals in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is the largest hospital network in the region and expanding incredibly quickly, and it's fantastic to have all this wealth of knowledge and different perspectives on one stage at a time. And I will also take my place here and then hand over to Dan, who will moderate the session. Then we'll have a chance as we go through to have some questions from the audience as well.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
Am I on? Can everybody hear me? Yes. Great presentation. Thank you ever so much. I think I'm going to address this to Rami first. Given that Nick's just talked about, asset valuation, talked about measuring brands, how are you measuring your brand? And how are you using that to make decisions for the growth of SGH?
So again, I echo your stuff. That was a fantastic presentation. Short, which is what I think appreciated at this time of day. But a very good presentation. So we measure in 3 different ways, or for 3 different purposes, if you will. One is decision-making, business decision-making. 2 is brand decision-making. And 3 is to be able to present it to the board and results that you need to present. Business decision-making, the value of your brand can help you, or just measuring your brand's value can help you in many different ways. For example, for us, we are quite a large, thank you for the introduction, we are one of the largest, if not the largest, hospital network in the region. We're just about to open our 10th hospital here in the UAE, in Ajman. And we have a 11th one opening up in Dammam in Saudi Arabia. Anyone familiar with the geography of Saudi? Khalid, I know you are. Anybody else?
I am.
There you go. Yeah. Well, a lot more of you will be going back and forth from there because Saudi is growing. So we're more based on the West Coast, but we are opening on the East Coast. So we're open. We have our first hospital is actually all the way in Jeddah, which is the West Coast, and now we're opening in Dammam. I hope that when we take these decisions, and I hope when we open, that name, that Saudi German hospital brand name, already is bringing me business the minute I open in Dammam, because it's very well known in the region, right? So that immediately brings me patients without even having to do any form of marketing, right? So this business decision making, even as a brand, I know a lot of you may not be in healthcare. Do we have anybody from healthcare? No? Okay. So within healthcare, we work together. You don't count. In healthcare, we have the brand, but we also have products or service lines, right? We have dermatology, we have cardiovascular surgery. We have different departments, medical departments. But that's also changing in today's world. So how do we structure that in a way that is appealing to people almost in a branded way, right? Creating medical departments in a branded way, as opposed to talking OB-GYN versus women's health. As a brand, women's health carries a lot more value than OB-GYN, right? So that's on a decision-making perspective. On a brand-building perspective, we're actually working with Landor, full disclosure. So we quite like them. I haven't been paid to say that.
You pay.
We pay, but I hope we pay less now, maybe. Look at you, Maria. Ash. So from a brand perspective, we are building, we're looking at our brand, and we want to be scientific when we make decisions, all the way from the color to the name to the logo. All of these things that people think don't matter matters, right? So knowing the value of that matters. And even when we're doing a whole architecture piece, do we want to have 150 different subsidiaries, or do we want to group them because it makes more sense? It'll give us more value to have them grouped because there's more equity and value in different brands. And the third, as I mentioned, is taking that to the boards, taking that even internally to measure ourselves against ourselves year on year, making sure that we are adding more value as a team and to the board. That's extremely important.
which is a great segue onto what is my next question, which I'm going to chuck to you, Ross, although I gather you have had a very good week.
Yeah.
Does everybody know Altair is one of the investors in Kareem? So yeah, there we go. Quite an interesting week.
Yeah, an interesting day.
Given that you can buy into brands and understand fully how they're now valued.
Not really, but I can try.
I was going to say, was it actually valued?
Well, Kareem. So yeah, so just to
No, okay.
yeah. So as you all know, Uber bought Kareem today, and that became common knowledge. So the company I work for, Altair, out of Saudi, is actually the largest corporate shareholder in Kareem. And so Kareem was bought for $3.1 billion US dollars, a mixture of, I think, cash and kind of future share options. And our group out of that today made 1.78 billion Saudi riyals. So I was in Riyadh today with my CEO. It was a very happy atmosphere around the office. There was cakes and much backslapping, and but yeah, I actually, it's kind of interesting because I had this conversation with Brunswick, who were running the comms for the IPO, and we just talked about the kind of insanity of it. Because Lyft, I don't know if you know Lyft, but Lyft IPO'd recently. So Lyft last year lost 900 million,
Wow.
and then at IPO the year after, still loss-making. Don't know about Kareem, but I'm pretty sure Uber is still a loss-making entity. But if anything, I think shows us the value of brand versus reality. It's the IPO valuations on what these companies are getting. I mean, they haven't made a cent, a dirham of profit. And they say that openly, and they also say, we're not likely to make profit for the next 8 to 10 years. But bear with us, and maybe your children will realize the value of the shares that you've got. So, yeah, I just think it's a kind of interesting, it just proves to me the value of brand measurement and equity in building that.
Which is kind of where we were going with the question, which is so how, obviously you have a portfolio of brands that are very powerful and make you a leader in the travel and tourism industry, which was the discussion we were having a little bit earlier on, actually, which was even enlightening for me, actually.
Well, not that powerful, because you didn't know what brands we had.
Well, yeah.
Tell them the truth, Dan.
That's true. I didn't realise you owned Al Mustafa. So, how are you using that to compete in what is an increasingly competitive industry with, OTAs coming in, online travel agencies coming in, aggregators like TripAdvisor and WeGo? How do you leverage those brands?
That's a big question. I think for me, there's three kind of enemies of brand management in the region at the moment that I really try and face head on and slay. And in no particular order, they are short-termism, communication, and tactification, which I obviously just made up there. But so for me, short-termism is, we're all, let's be honest, we all probably work in companies and for managers or CEOs who don't particularly understand the value of long-term brand building. And so there's a massive pressure on us as marketeers to focus on bottom of the funnel, BOFU, sales activation. And it's like you're on a hamster wheel, CTRs and PPC, ROIs, because in some way you can then justify what you're doing. But that completely negates the impact and importance of long-term brand building. Because what we all know here is that you need more than 6 months to kind of see those long-term brand building effects, right? Market share, profit, brand share, voice. And it's really hard to punch out in this. Well, I found it personally difficult here. I think the second enemy for me, let's see the second enemy, is communication. And I think as a marketer or as marketeers, we've kind of boxed ourselves in into a much smaller box than we used to be. So I'm getting on a bit now. So like, just hit 41, so I'm dealing with that kind of middle-aged crisis. But I remember when I first started in marketing, I started at Sony in London as a product manager. And there, it was great because I had responsibility for pricing and inventory and sales and product development, which is like kind of the 4 Ps. I know you can have 4 Ps and 7 Ps and whatever, but 4 is enough for me. But it kind of feels like now, if the companies I work with, if they said, oh, we've got this pricing strategy, and I said, okay, let's just run that through the marketing team, the CEO would be like, what? What, you mean to design the slides? Well, let's give this to finance or give this to the data team, right? So it feels a bit like we've become just communicators, but as marketeers, we've forgotten a little bit about pricing and distribution and product. And I think for me, it's important that we try and regain some of that to gain more salience in boardroom discussions.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, and what was the third one I said?
Tactification.
Oh, tactification.
The made up one.
Yeah. So tactification is we try and have a discussion about strategy, but then someone comes in from left field and says, yeah, why don't we do a Snapchat filter like this? And all of a sudden, you're talking about tactics, right? The conversation about strategy is completely hijacked. And to be honest, I've sometimes been as guilty as anyone else of doing that. But it was really refreshing, actually, I think, Nick, to hear your presentation, because it highlighted to me the importance of the 3-stage process. And the 3 stages for me are like diagnosis, which is market research, then strategy. And only once you've done those first 2 stages should you even let anyone talk about tactics. And I think, in terms of approach to brand development, is trying to take on those 3 enemies head on. I don't know, do you guys feel the same thing? Do you have the same issues?
I love the concept of tactification. I think that's just so true.
Yeah.
Call it 5-year-olds on a football pitch. Oh, the ball's gone this way.
And your Snapchat filter example is brilliant. I actually have dealt with that in the last couple of
Have you?
days.
Yeah.
So we need a Snapchat filter. Why?
Yeah. It's true, but you need robust research.
Yes, to counter it.
You need a strategy, and then you talk about tactics. But I think too often we're straight in there.
Is research strong enough as a function in the Middle East? Is this why it's falling down? I practice research, marketer qualified and researcher by profession.
That's a good question. I think probably I'd look at ourselves as well as marketers. I'd say that probably we're not strong enough in putting a stake in the ground and saying, you know what? Because think about it, right? I think, how many of you are brand managers or work with brands or marketing directors or, like, do you think that you really know your brand the best? Yes or no?
Yes, no.
That's interesting, right? Because I have a theory in that the moment you sign your name on that employment contract, you own it, but you lose complete objectivity about what that brand is to a consumer. Like suddenly you think differently about that thing, don't you? You just do it. But then I think then it's incumbent on us to get those research inputs, to really be humble and really understand what our consumers are saying about our brand, because all of us overestimate the role of our brands in the life of our consumers, right? We do, 100%. Ultimately, the brands that we look after, no one really spares 2 or 3 seconds of thought about, but for us, it's the world. But I think having that research input that helps us understand the context and the market orientation is super important.
I think you said something else very important, that we tend to box ourselves as communicators. And that is very dangerous. It's a disservice to us. Because when we box ourselves and say, well, this isn't my scope. My scope is to communicate. My scope is to advertise. My scope is to do PR. There's a danger of missing big elements or main elements that contribute to brand value. One of them, for example, experience, right? We typically don't think of ourselves as those responsible for experience, but we are. We are, and it can add huge value to a brand. If you enhance that experience, looking at technology today, a lot of companies are bringing in transformation teams, not considering that this could be, for example, hand in hand developed with a marketing team. It's in a lot of organizations, actually, it's IT led, which is a huge issue.
Yes.
With all my respect to people in IT, they know how to build technology, but they don't know how to build it necessarily for people. And that's what we do. That's what we do. We understand people. That's what marketers do, because we are the eyes and ears of the organization, right? We're the first people exposed to customers. So that's one thing that is on us, to take more responsibility and say, experience, I'm going to take ownership of that. I'm going to try and find ways. I'm going to add it as one of my objectives. My objectives aren't only to increase awareness, to drive revenue, etc. I'm also going to add an objective in my yearly strategy to improve customer experience, and I'm going to add a KPI to that. And you present that to your board, and nobody's going to say no to you taking the lead on something that may be a weakness in your organization.
I think that's quite an interesting point. I mean, as marketeers, how many of you actually have an active involvement in product development or engagement with the customer experience team, for example?
Fights, definitely.
That's actually really scary. There's like 8 hands up. which, if you think about what the basis of product is, the whole point of having a product is to market it, right? I mean, sell it and create a brand. That's quite an interesting point, really interesting point. I mean, I'm going to chuck the next one at you, Nick, because you just stood here and introduced something. I'll be honest, I was not familiar Landor did. And I'm familiar with a lot of brand evaluation structures and brand health and brand tracking. So, why is BAV, better than some of the more known models?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that there are a couple of points I would make. One is that Landor has an expertise that is around brand, and the way that brand is managed and understood is changing, which is why Landor therefore is changing, and changing the way what we offer, and changing how we look at brand and measure brand, and also deliver brand, because that's incumbent upon us, and that enables us, we hope, to remain being experts in brand. In terms of BAV, it's very interesting. It was something invented by Walter Landor 25 years ago, and it's one of very few normative brand databases. So the other one, as some of our colleagues here will know, is Brand Z from Milward Brown. But once you go beyond BAV, and Brand Z is better known, but once you go beyond BAV and Brand Z, there aren't actually very many really fully validated. There are lots of ways of measuring brand, but not in a fully validated way. I think that when I compare the two I know best, which is Brand Z and BAV, the truth is that they both have strengths and weaknesses. On balance, I prefer BAV, not simply because I'm at Landor now.
That's what you're saying. You forget everything once you sign the contract.
BAV's better.
BAV's better. It says here, there's a check in the post. But there's
Emma took note.
BAV, I feel, is slightly better because the way it constructs a future view is a little bit better than Brand Z. There are other areas when you go into some of the methodologies behind Brand Z, you would argue they're more robust. So there are pros and cons between the two. But I think that in the end, what they both offer is two things. One is they offer a validated methodology for measuring brand. And I think if you can't measure brand equity, and brand equity is not awareness, usage, consideration and preference. It's important, but that is not brand equity, as we all know. It is not brand equity. So you need a way of measuring the way that people feel about brands, but then you need a benchmark for understanding what that feeling means. And again, a validated methodology does that, and the reason it does that is because both Brandsy and BAV have normative databases that allow us to compare, to understand how brands move over time, to understand what makes brands better or different, and also to understand how fast or slow brands can change. And I was making the point about future facing. Ross was underlining it. It's very difficult to make things change rapidly in 6 months for a brand. You might be able to spike awareness or spike some retweets or something, but that doesn't actually move brand equity over time. It really is a super tanker, and it needs consistent investment in order to do that, and it also needs consistent investment in the right thing. So I think that the main reason I like BAV is basically because it's ours, and whether we can claim...
Your bonus is on its way,
yes.
Nick.
But there are, and there are not many others out there, and my colleagues, I used to work at Millward Brown with Brandsy, and they would argue that theirs might be better, but I think that in the end you need a robust methodology.
Yeah.
And we happen to have one of the robust methodologies, which is extremely pleasing. It's not the only fruit, but it is one of the better fruits, I think.
See, I'm going to take that point, and I really like the point that you brought up earlier about research, and the room went silent. So, I mean, you look after this region for Landor. So, you work with Nick very closely on insights, but you also work with clients on a regular basis. What is your benchmarking like in this region?
I mean, it's difficult. People often, say that benchmarking in this region is difficult because the data doesn't exist, and even some of our own, studies are not necessarily done on as regular a basis here in the Middle East, but also many other markets that I work in, like Russia, etc. It's not done to the same extent. However, I think the beauty of BAV, and Nick, if you repeat this as well, you'll also be flying the flag. But no, the beauty of BAV is that it's really about a methodology, and it's a proprietary methodology. So what we have found with clients where we have done this type of metric and modelling in this market, and other markets within the region, is that we can do a bespoke piece of research which uses the same methodology as the BAV global database. So, there are 49 attributes, I think, that we measure brands against, and we look at drivers of change against a common set of attributes. And what that does is it allows us, on the one hand, to actually relatively cost efficiently create, measure a client's brand against other benchmarks, which are relevant to them in the market, whether it's in category or out of category. But then also, look at global benchmarks and how global brands behave, because we've got this massive database globally that we can then benchmark against. So by using the same methodology, the same attributes to measure brand, even a bespoke piece of research, it enables us to scale the benchmarking up, and that's how we fill the gaps that a global database may have. So I think that's one of probably one of the common misconceptions when we do talk to people about BAV. People who know it think it's a database, and but if it hasn't been run in the last 6 weeks, then it's no longer relevant. The methodology that we use to do the bespoke research enables us to learn and benchmark against the global database. Is that correct, Nick?
That's a great answer, Emma. Thank you very much, yes.
It's a very good answer.
But also, I'd like to just pick up on the point that you mentioned before, because I've actually just come this evening, having spent a couple of days with a client in Dammam, who are in the process of creating a new brand in a related sector. And we actually sat and talked about research today, and they've commissioned, I want to say, close to $500,000 worth of research, which is going to bring them nothing with regards to brand insights. It's all about sales, it's all about statistics, it's all about,
Analyst data.
Yeah, it's analyst data, but this is the brand management. So they've got a budget to commission data research to get insights, but they've let themselves be pushed by the salespeople who also want to find this out, by the product people who want to find this out. And all of a sudden, of this $500,000 that they're spending, there's about 5% which will give them any insight on brands. So I think, when we do this type of work in this region in particular, I think there are challenges, but actually I think it's not down to the quality of research or the quality of the ability of agencies in this region to do quality research. I think it's often the fact that clients will let themselves be driven by other departments who are contributing towards the budget, and ultimately what they're getting out is not really helping them to define what they need.
Interesting.
I think that's because a lot of, again, if we're being honest, a lot of brands and companies in the region don't actually have a brand strategy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and I think, I was thinking what your comments made me think, of two very contrasting clients that we work for, who will remain nameless, but one is a bank, and they are, the brand management function is in charge of communications, to your point, Rami, and they say, well, we can't influence the branches. You think, well, that's like half the experience for half your customers, and you're brand managers, and you don't actually influence that. So that's on the one end, and that does, marketing no favours at all, because then you're just seen as a centre of spending money with no evidential base for creating value. They don't know how they create value for their company, because they can't. They can just spend money. And you can only do that in an environment where people believe in their hearts automatically the brand is fantastic. Places like Unilever, where I started, and P&G and other Mars, who just believe that brand is fundamental to the business. Most banks don't. At the other end of the scale is an online business in Europe. And the marketing guy, the head of marketing, is doing some modelling with us, but he's doing some modelling on the basis of when the private equity backers are going to leave. So he's trying to work out precisely the optimal brand architecture and brand portfolio when the private equity backers want to exit. And secondly, the other model is if they think they might get acquired by an American player. So we're doing another model that says what is the maximum brand can bring to the party at the point at which we think this American player will come in. And you think, he is therefore influencing the business from A to Z, not from A to C. And that's what marketing should be doing. So, to your point, Ross, therefore he's in charge of product, he's in terms of experience, he's in terms of brand investment, he's in terms of brand positioning, he's in terms of brand portfolio, he's in charge of everything because he's answering the business's questions.
And what I think is interesting about what you said, Nick, in your second bullet point about brand asset measurement, you talked about brand portfolio optimization. Excuse me, and to me, that's often about not what we can add on, it's what we can take away, right?
Yes, that's true.
And the Henkel example, and it's just, there's that kind of, I can't believe I'm doing this, but there's a panel conference Sun Tzu quote, but, Sun Tzu, Art of War, he said, actually strategy is about what roads not to take,
yes, that's right,
and what towns not to besiege, and what armies not to fight.
Yes.
And I think that's a super important message for us as well, because again, in the region and the environment, there's often it's all very additive. Things are added, channels and brands and products and services, but nothing's ever really taken away, right? So it kind of feels to me like we should almost sit down and spring clean and use that methodology to kind of really refocus.
And one of the biggest challenges around data now is that data is so numerous and plentiful. The real challenge is to use that data from a strategic, top-down point of view. We've got more than enough data that will tell you whether to do a Facebook filter or whether to do another execution on Snapchat. That doesn't move brand equity. That may be very important in running the business week to week or day to day, but the challenge is to take all the data views that we have and to use that from a strategic, top-down point of view that will actually move mountains over time?
I think digital, while it's great, and you know, I have a digital background, so while it's great, it's done us a little bit of a disservice. The amount of data that we can provide through digital and data that's relevant to our bottom line, well, we talk about how much ROI we can generate from digital, has meant that once you introduce those kind of measures, that's what management starts to expect, right? That's what the board will start to expect. They want, so when you do those tactics that drive high ROI, they'll expect more and more of that, and less of the brand building activities, the long term, the ones that don't necessarily show you what your ROI is. And it becomes a little bit of a challenge then to try and push that. And sometimes as marketers, well, I do definitely advocate scientifically based decisions and not sort of basing it on what one person said to another and anecdotal data. Still, there's something about your gut feeling, right? There's something about knowing something that sometimes is just, you will not be able to prove through ROI right away, but you just know is right. And there's, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about it. I can't remember which one of his... Blink, yes, Blink. You know, about, and I think it's that part of your brain that doesn't process language that probably is what drives that. It was very hard to try and explain that in today's world to management, to your board, when you have digital and that can prove quite the opposite. Yet you somehow know that these activities in the long run are what's going to generate value as opposed to ROI.
But if I may, I think just to join the dots between the conversation, so I think there are two things. So one thing is around that appreciation of intuition, because you really have to have that, I think, in order to be successful. But the other part, and they should be able to coexist, is around the humility to say, I don't know.
Yep.
Because when that happens, and I'm the CCO at Kantar, when that happens, the magic happens with the relationship with your agency.
Yeah.
Because that's when you move forward. And they're not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. My fight.
No, I agree. I think that humility is really important.
It's the two.
You know, it goes back to a point about market orientation. When you're in a brand and working with a business, you completely overestimate the impact of that business in the lives of your consumers. So that's why you want to work with great agency partners who can kind of say, okay, you know, here's the reality of it. It's a great point.
It's also important to find ways of reminding yourself of that. I mean, the last couple of years moved from a brand that's fairly well known. I don't know how many of you people know Do.
Small. Just a little bit.
Letitia is actually my successor on that, and I think Ash is here as well, who's just worked on that brand. But one of the things you always have to keep reminding yourself, especially when you work with people like Vodafone or you work with people like a Etisalat, who are huge globally, is Do's a tiny, tiny operator. Now, I work for an entire emirate at the moment, and as I mentioned the name to Nick earlier, he went, never heard of it. You know, we had 1 million visitors last year, which is I think the first time we've ever had it, and there are people here that may have never been to Ras Al Khaimah and may never have heard of it. But again, trying to then understand how you take that to market, how you have not just humility, but also the objectification to look at it and go, right, how can we do this smartly? How can we actually bring this to market in a way that makes sense? We often get driven right down the route you're talking about, right? It's very easy, and you know this from the business you're in, you know that OTA conversion path, pixel tracking, all of the digital tracking in the travel industry is phenomenal. But when people land in the hotel doesn't know who they are. They get a booking reference and an ID, and that's it. And that's quite scary. I mean, that's something that, you know, I mean, having moved from telco, where we know absolutely everything about our customers down to where they were 5 minutes ago physically, to an industry where a group of people hold all that information, but they don't share it with the people delivering the experience, the people actually delivering the promise, the people selling the destination. is a really odd dynamic where data's not being shared in the right way. And on that note, so I apologise for taking over there. I'm going to chuck this one out because I find this quite interesting actually. Right, brand value, or brand health, or brand tracking. Which is more important?
What a fascinating question. I'll go and do some research on that and get back to you. I think.
I don't know the difference between them.
Yeah, well,
Honestly.
well, brand
There's a
Start there,
humility.
Nick.
brand value is it's a really interesting approach. I mean, obviously, what he's trying to do is put a value around brand. The issue, I think, is having spent many years valuing brands. I do think that the idea of brand value itself is somewhat esoteric, because you can't. It's very difficult to take brand value to the bank. What is not esoteric is the commercial impact of brand. So what we try to do is to understand, again, to try and put financial and commercial impacts around brand and brand change. That's really, really important. And I think that, so that's a really important metric. I think that brand tracking, I mean, if you do, as they say, if you don't measure, you can't manage. So that is important. Mm-hmm. And I think when you asked about brand health, I mean, brand health is, I think, the starting point. If you can't identify what it is that creates your brand health or your brand equity, then nothing else flows from there. As soon as you identify it, then you can decide whether you want to measure it in a particular way or track it or to put value around it. But so I would say, having dealt with all three multiple times over many, many years, I would say the core of this is brand health. You have to have a way of identifying what is the status of your brand and also what is working and what isn't. And therefore you have to have a strategy to address, do you strengthen your strengths or do you address your weaknesses? Because actually very often you can't do both. You don't have time or money, so you've got to make a choice. Then I would say, from my purview now, that actually putting financial metrics around it is the second most important and tracking is the third most. But they're all important, and to be honest, they all change in importance somewhat depending on quite where you are. But the starting point is you have to understand your brand health. So that would be my number one choice at all times.
Which kind of leads on to something actually Rami and I were discussing earlier, which is, if you look at brand drivers, right? So you have experience, you have communications, you have growth and development. So looking at the growth plans that you have for Saudi German Hospital, how are you investing in those different aspects? You talked earlier about taking a brand to a whole new coast. You've taken a complex brand, I think Khaled made this point earlier, Saudi German Hospital, into countries like Dubai and Egypt. So you've got Saudi German Hospital, Egypt, Saudi. How are you dealing with that aspect? Where are you investing to actually deliver that brand?
So, one of the main investments is ensuring that our brand has equity. Our brand has equity, and as we said and mentioned many times, you don't shift equity overnight, right? And there are long-term plans that we need to build as an organization. One of the main challenges that we see today, and our research will prove, we're undergoing research, will prove this to us, is that we could be potentially being seen as an aging brand, right? We were established in 1988. So
most people wouldn't call that aging, but okay, we're in the Middle East.
In the region. So, just like infrastructure, it gets old. People are feel less positive when they go into an older building, older infrastructure. It's the same thing with a brand, right? So if your brand hasn't been touched or hasn't been rejuvenated in all these years, that's how people's sentiments are going to start shifting towards your brand, which is to feel you're an old brand and I can't relate to you. So that's one thing we are looking at, is the rejuvenation of the brand, by not only by, bringing in a new logo and a new look and feel. No, the actual brand, the actual feel of it as you walk into a hospital change. So we're changing the way, as I mentioned earlier, the way we talk about healthcare. We're changing the way physically some of our hospitals look like. So we're making them look a lot more contemporary, a lot more modern. The type of procedures we're even looking into is some of the cutting edge procedures that you're seeing in the West that haven't been brought in so all of these actually contribute to your brand. And when we are making decisions, we're making them not just the physician alone, but as a team. And one of the things that I spoke about was experience. So we've actually brought in very recently a chief experience officer, because that is important. And I think a lot of brands aren't considering that. So that will add value. And when you do all these activities and all these as you position yourself for today and for tomorrow, as you showed in your presentation, that there's value in positioning yourself today for tomorrow, as you open in new markets, as you expand, you'll have the opportunity to present that brand with that new hospital. So you've rejuvenated, you've built for the future, you open a new place, and you're living your promise right away from day one. So it's preparing for the future is what I'd say. Those long-term tactics. Having said that, though, if you only build for the future, you're not going to have a job for long, right? You're going to be spending, building for the future. What have you generated today? So you have to complement that with your long-term tactics, your medium-term tactics, and your short-term tactics, and you have to make it very clear what each one is. And short-term tactics tend to be very, very short-term tactics, and this region does like those short-term tactics. But if you are able to produce them, and you're able to bring in the results that are expected of you, that buys you time for your long-term tactics, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a really nice segue to how Khaled opened this, right? Which is shooting and aiming afterwards. And with that, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So, does anybody have any questions that they want to ask? Yes. Have we got a? I think you just have to speak up a little bit.
Okay, no problem.
Hello, testing. I don't know. Thank you, Alistair.
Okay, sure. My name is Pamela. I'm here with Majid Al Futtaim. Or I'm not with Majid Al Futtaim, but I work for Majid Al Futtaim.
Majid could make it.
My question is related to the company I work for. It's a person's name, as you know. And I suppose my question is geared more towards the Landor people. And what is your experience in dealing with brands that have confusion behind their brand name because the same name exists in another brand, partially? In this case, for us, it's Al Futtaim. And a lot of people confuse us between Al Futtaim and Majid Al Futtaim. And my question is really about, like, what is a healthy level of confusion to live with, in your opinion?
So it was a very good question. Do you want to take that one, Nick?
Yes, I'm absolutely delighted to take that one. It's a great question. I mean, I think one of the worst examples we came across was Merck, the chemicals and drugs company, because there's huge confusion in terms of the European and the American operations, and it stemmed from licensing agreements and franchising agreements from way back when. I mean, I think that a couple of points. If you've got confusion, I think that you can either do one of three things. You can either piggyback on it, because if you're getting free publicity, hey, why not? All publicity is good publicity. And I think you've then got to decide whether it's doing your business any good or not. Because if you're a small player piggybacking on a big player, who cares? Seriously, I mean, it may not be a sort of long-term.
I think McDonald's have had some court cases on that kind
of
stuff.
Well, that's right. Yes, but I mean, if it's legitimate confusion, if it says, for instance, family name, I mean, it's not that you made something up in order to look like KFC or something, but if it's something like that. I think the second thing is that if you're the bigger player, then it's incumbent upon you to actually stake your claim to the territory and see that other person off. And if there is confusion, then I think it's your job to resolve that confusion by putting distance between what you've got and what the other person has. And I'm not necessarily talking about legal cases. I'm talking about communications and positioning and identity and so on. In the most extreme case, we have come across the point where actually one of them says, this is too much, I'm just going to change my brand. Because it just becomes, it's not doing any good to their business, it's almost doing too much damage. But I think that the starting point would be the middle option, which is, where is that confusion stemming from? Is it something that we can help manage or control, or is it something that we could do better? Because if it's willful confusion, then you can probably do something about it legally. If it's just kind of just things that come out in the marketplace, then I think what you have to do is you have to start off looking at yourself rather than blaming the other guy. I'm not saying you are blaming the other guy, but look at yourself first and say, is there something that we could do differently or better to actually put clear blue water between ourselves and these other people who we don't actually like walking on our patch. And if that would be my starting point. Whether that would give you the answer you need at the end of the day is perhaps another question. I don't know the details, but there were two arms going on. That would be my starting point.
We have another question.
No, I'm just going to add to this. I'm not going to speak brand speak. I'm going to speak consumer speak. I haven't got a clue who's who. And I've been in this country for 8 years. Because I go into a place and they say Fatain, magical Fatain. So yes, you do have a challenger, and as the brand manager or the marketing director, and you need to at one point with a new generation. It's about generation because I can understand. I just started my speak with my name is on the pack to kind of convince them to evolve into something. Because right now, if these two families, this one family has split, to me, I don't know the difference. I go into one shop or one mall or one cinema, I have no idea who's who as a consumer. Now, from a brand speak, of course, you can go into the juggling stuff, but I'm telling you, as a consumer, you've got a challenge.
I actually think Majid Al-Fatam has done a good job. I do think I think they've done a good job, and I don't know if it's an official MAF is the official branding to say MAF, but I hear it a lot. I heard the words MAF a lot, which is a way of differentiating. You've now created an acronym, which is a way, right? You have different ways of redoing your brand. You use the same brand but create acronyms. You make it more modern, right? So MAF is, and it's actually easy to say. It's
MAF, but then changed to MAF.
I think MAF is better.
Nice try.
But even your architecture is very clear which brands belong to you. Yeah. So and we've studied that. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions. Sorry.
So I've got a question. So I've been 20 years in digital, and there's a belief that there's a new strand of marketing called purpose marketing, which is the product is the brand. And my question is, if the product is the brand, and if we look at things like the Dollar Shave Club and other like scrappy startups that are saying, I actually trade on what my brand does as the brand, what is the value of the equity of the brand in these business models? Because they're actually stealing huge amounts of share from long-term, familiar, established brands that are struggling with these startups in the direct-to-consumer world.
You're looking at me a lot when you asking me that question.
And I quite like some of these startups, right? This gets actually back to the Kareem discussion, right? Which is they're experience based, which is what a brand is. I'm actually a big fan of Harry's, which is very similar to Dollar Shave Club. They do one thing, they make it as easy as possible for you to do. Even here, you can get it done. And I think that's where what we're seeing is a change in the business scape.
Yeah, or the purpose brand.
Yeah, but you know, you look at, I mean, Dollar Shave Club is a really good example. Look at Gillette, and I will come to you in a minute, Ash, and I know you used to work on Gillette. You know, Gillette had this whole, well, it's a razor, right? Everybody shaves the same, so we'll do one ad and we'll just put it around the world and everything's fine.
They change it to the best a man can be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is polarizing.
But it hasn't worked. It's overpriced. You know, they keep reinventing the wheel for no apparent reason. You know, I think we've been having whiter washing powder for what, how many years now? And it's the same thing, you know, how many razor blades are they going to stick on a razor? And then you get back into these people that are now reinventing what is a non-reinvented industry. And actually all they're doing is making it app usable, making it consumable in a more manageable way. And okay, their product is their brand, but their product is the experience.
But I think just to add to that, because it's a fascinating example, I think that there are a number of things that come together when you talk about shaving. One is, well, you have a shaver and some brushes.
No pun intended.
But I think that when you look at Gillette, they have a system that they have implemented, and they've implemented it in a very sort of regimented way for many decades. So, and to be fair, the longer they've gone on, the more they've been ripe for disruption. What has been stopped is that the people who play the same game as Gillette, like Schick and Wilkinson Sword, haven't been able to disrupt them because Gillette are just too powerful in the channels through which they operate. So disruption for the shaving industry has come through online, as indeed it has done for many, many other businesses, not least retail. So you could argue that Gillette was an industry where disaster was waiting to happen. It's just they found a way of finally starting to deliver that, and it is hurting them a lot. The second thing is the brand and experience. It's very interesting. I mean, Unilever have bought Dollar Shave, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So they will have bought out for two reasons, or maybe three. One, they don't like P&G apparently. The second thing is that they will see that as a way of getting into the internet, because clearly their core business is absolutely stuck to the retail channel. But the third thing is that they wouldn't buy a business or build a business unless it had brand potential, unless they had a brand that it could manage. And maybe, yes, as you say, it's perhaps a different way that it's built. It's more experiential and so on, but it's still a brand. And Unilever will work that very, very hard, I think, because they will see value in brand. They always do. They would never buy anything that didn't have a brand attached to it. So I think that, I mean, it's a fascinating example, but I think that also it's we look at many markets which have been disrupted horribly, and that's one of them. In many ways, Gillette was so successful for so long that actually it was waiting for a fall. And when you look at the pricing, when you look at its ranging, the fact that it never knowingly withdrawn any SKU. And how do you as a retailer go, oh good, you're going to make me take 357 SKUs, not 342. Thanks. They've got massive security issues in retail. But the fact is that they were waiting for a fall, and someone's finally worked out how to do it. And the amazing thing is how long they went on without being challenged in many ways.
Mr. Banerjee.
I want to go back to the lady in the corner who asked the question about how much confusion is necessarily a good thing. It's an absolutely brilliant question because, you know, if we talk to our counterparts in the wealth management business who look after family businesses, they will tell you that family wealth in family-owned businesses dilutes over time as the businesses fragment. And this is the story of quite a few of the major UAE-based business houses, because as the businesses begin to fragment, the parts of the business that understand brand better tend to do better. You see that in MAF, you see that in Al Ghurair, you see that in Rustamani, you see that in a lot of the other houses as well. So the question there is between, what you said about MAF versus the other part of the Al-Futtaim business. Actually, MAF is a holding company with a bunch of consumer-facing brands who are all doing rather well because they're well-constructed brands. Al-Futtaim overall is a somewhat nebulous holding company business which has a lot of direct-to-consumer business through automotive and other sectors, but it's not particularly well differentiated. So it's something that that business might want to think about. And of course, if you'd like to think about it, then we might want to help you think about it.
All right, we're going to take one more question from the gentleman here.
So thank you for having me here. So I'm not from the Marketing Society. I'm a third-generation surgeon. I work with Rami doing strategy for the group. So I was asked in business school, so why is a surgeon getting into marketing?
I'm intrigued.
I said, yeah, so, and this is to the point, correct? That brands are essentially two things, correct? One's the expectation, and second is the experience you get out. And I think in different industries, and you've covered many, this gets swapped, correct? In the initial stages of a brand, it's the experience which matters, say for the service industry like hospitals, and then the expectation overlies it. So for consumer awareness, first line and top line awareness, it's the expectations as you go on. So one of the challenges we face, and that's why I'm addressing this question to you, is that you all assume, and we all assume, that hospitals are a single brand. But hospitals are just like Henkel. They have numerous brands under them, which attract patients. Some repel them because the experience, and to the point of brand building, you can destroy a brand in a day, but you build a brand over a century, correct? So how do you address that? And me and Rami often have this intellectual debate, and constructively.
That's good. Sometimes. You saw how he spoke about the debate.
On how will you cohesively, correct, improve that expectation quotient of the people and the experience. And the experience in clinical medicine lies in the outcome, and then the social interaction around, the financial and all that. The outcome is the primitive and the primal reason why you go to a hospital. So this is a society full of marketing guys, correct? So what is your experience with hospitals? Private hospitals more so, and with this respect on brand building. Physicians are brands, clinical units are brands, surgical outcomes are brands, hospitals are bouquet of brands, as Henkel. We adopt certain brands. You see a billboard here with 5 doctors on their faces, because each one is a brand, right? They've reached that state after the individual sort of marquees in their field. And the challenge now is that, yes, we have to evolve as a brand with the touch and feel of the brand and the legacy of the brand, but the future still outlays that we do the right clinical work to support it. Correct. The more you raise my expectations, if my experience doesn't match it, you're destroying it. So the experience has to rise, and then the tide rises the expectations. So open.
I would flip that back to you and look at the origins of your name, right? Why did that name come about?
So did the name create the brand? That's what I'm asking.
No.
Or was it the clinical
What I'm
practice of the
asking you
group?
is, in the name itself, is what is actually you guys ride on, which is a Saudi Arabian hospital that specialise in having German levels of treatment with German physicians, which I know you're growing and changing and developing, but that's the absolute basis of what your business model was.
No, that was a misnomer. Right?
Oh, okay, all right.
So going back to the challenges, and this is a great touch point on this, correct? So the name itself could be a misnomer, correct? But the brand was built by the service environment of that hospital in Saudi Arabia to be in geographies where there was nobody at that point 30 years back, to be in Yemen when the war was going on. So there's a huge legacy to that brand. And the name was a rider which was never taken off. But I don't want to go specifically to that. We're talking more of hospitals, correct?
Yeah.
Healthcare. I'm being selfish here because I have a talent pool I can't
I'm gonna call that we need to take this offline.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a good point.
If you want to just wrap it up so we can thank everyone.
Yes.
We're losing people. I'm just.
No, that's fine. Thank you all very much for coming, actually. I want to say thank you to Nick. Thank you to Rami.
Thank you.
I will.
Thank you, Emma. I appreciate it. And thank you very much, Ross, as well, for coming in. Callan, do you want to just come up and close us down?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, all of you, for a fantastic discussion. And to your point, your name is, just to make sure that...
Anshul.
Anshul. Let me kind of wrap it up with this. We are all brands. The people, and I think you kind of wrapped it up with the concept of physicians are a sub-brand of a house of brands. And that conversation can continue with the experts. But if I just kind of close the day and say, whilst we are talking about brands and value of brands, one thing that potentially would be missing, because now we have so much analytics out there, we have a lot of influencers that are brands, we have people who are brands today. Maybe there is an opportunity for some sort of valuation on people brands, and that's a conversation to be had to continue this. So with that, a big thank you to everyone. Where is my clicker? Okay. So again, thank you, Dan, for a great moderating. Ross, Emma, who's still there, Rami, and Nick. Here we go. Of course, we've had a question, and I want to thank Landor for a fantastic evening, because obviously without them we wouldn't have this evening here tonight. So a big thank you to our friends at Landor. We have cards. We'd like to do that more digitally in the future, but you have cards there. Please tell us what you think about the evening. As the Marketing Society, we are always busy, active with different events, just like this one. We have many things coming up, just the ones to note in your diary. We have on the 17th of April, Under the Spotlight with our friends at IBM, with Susan, who's the CMO. It'll be a great conversation. Under the Spotlight is you put someone there and you really grill them. So come on down, listen to what's happening. Again, IBM driving some fantastic conversations around digital and other things. We've got, if you like this brand conversation, come on down on the 17th of September, so put that on your diary. And our flagship for the year, so we'll bring a couple of hundred people, is our Bravest conference. We started with Bravest conference. We'll bring in a lot of great speakers, a whole afternoon, morning, whatever we end up doing, but that's a great thing to kind of put in your diaries. And with that, I say a big thank you to all of you, and have a drink. I don't know what's happening. Have a drink.